happy to introduce you to the Director of Environmental Studies in NYU. He has written a lot of books. One of them is Metapatterns across space, time, and mind. He's currently working on a follow-up book on that. He has written on Gaia's body, CO2 rising, death and sex, together with Dorian Sagan. And today he's going to be talking about levels, realms, and meta-patterns in biological and cultural evolution.
Natalie, thank you so much for the invite to this really fabulous conference and for putting it together. So I'm going to be giving today a look at patterns as a qualitative talk. I'm interested in pattern formation at different scales. And I'll define some of these terms, and I'm going to be looking at realms of physical, biological, and cultural evolution. I've been well, you'll see what I've been thinking about for a little while here as I go. The basic scheme is going to be the fact that the universe occurs at a number of fundamental levels of types that start off with the parts of the standard model of physics and end up with some levels of society here above. There's these realms, three large realms of various dynamics that are involved, and there's levels within those realms. Now, one of the words I like to use is metapatterns. This was coined by the well-known anthropologist and epistemologist, studied animal communication, various cultures, Gregory Bateson. He didn't use the word very often. In fact, he might have only used it once, but I thought it was an intriguing word. The concept with metapatterns is that it's like a pattern, but it's more widespread than you would typically say. It crosses some kind of level. It's not a term that I'm going to define in any way. It's a term that is I use as a heuristic to induce me to do certain kinds of thinking, certain kinds of searching. And I developed a number of metapatterns, which are, you can think of them as topological logic, borders of systems, binary systems, levels of systems, time, the arrows of continuity, breaks or transformations of systems. And these I developed a number of years back, and each one, some are visual patterns, for example, borders down here. There's a number of different sub-metapatterns of these metapatterns that I developed. That's really not my talk today, but I'm trying to get you into the history of how this recent investigation that I'm asking you to share in, and I hope to have some conversations about how this started with me. I just want to set the clock. And so I just want to show you that they have sub-patterns, and what I did in the book was to carry through looking at these patterns from physical into biological, cultural, and mental manifestations. So I was thinking of, rather than organizing a follow-up work around each pattern, to trace them from the simplest things in the universe, let's say the elementary particles of physics, upwards through various scales. And a pattern that I had been working with before, called Holarchy, started taking on strong prominence in my mind, because as we build up from simple things into more complex things, it happens in steps, and so you get parts related to each other and forming wholes. And this goes through a series of levels. Some people call this a nested hierarchy. I prefer the term that was coined by Arthur Kessler, systems theorist, a holarchy, because the word hierarchy can get used in other kinds of ways, and I didn't want to always call it a nested kind of hierarchy. But this could be a biological classification system. This could be the organization of an automobile. Universities are organized this way as schools, and within them are departments, and within departments are faculty. And I was thinking about this pattern in the following way, that if you take that very often, as you go inside into component parts and component parts of those wholes that have component parts, you often are going back in time in terms of the creation of the type. So for example, you go from a flower to the cells in the flower. The cell as a type in the story of the universe, the saga of the universe, preceded the flower, and the molecule preceded the cell, and the atom preceded the molecule. So you're going back in time. Now, I do want to say you have to be very careful to distinguish, are we talking about the origin of the specific types of cells within that flower, or are we talking about the origin of cell as a type? So you just have to, just want to be, that I am aware of that. It depends on what kind of level, what kind of logical level you're talking about here. And so the origin of any kind of cell preceded the origin of a multicellular organ, the flower. You go back in time. Now, I'm going to be showing you sort of my interpretation of how this happened in forward time and how one can use this as a way to search for patterns. But I want to note a couple influences and prominent thinkers along this. One is Jacob Bernowski, scientist, historian, author, and television presenter of the Ascent of Man series. And he wrote a very influential paper in Zygon magazine called Stratified Stability. And he proposed it as a principle in which certain kinds of entities, certain kinds of whole systems had to form before next levels of whole systems could form, and that you get strata of stability. And he named it a principle. And we have to, one thing is you can question, what does it mean for this to be a principle? This is not obviously a principle like a law of physics, but it's a repeating pattern of structure formation. Andrew Bork, a scientist in the UK, an entomologist, studies insect societies, wrote a book recently called Principles of Social Evolution. That Science magazine said it seemed to be the follow-up to some of Maynard Smith's and Zermathi's major transitions of evolution. I also mentioned Dan McShay here. Didn't show Dan's picture because you're going to see him live in person tomorrow. But the idea of social evolution here is not human society, but that each step in the major transitions going from, let's say, prokaryotic cells to eukaryotic cells to multicellular organisms to animal societies was a social evolution at that scale that involved problems, issues of coordination, issues of policing, to not have the other units become too renegade or go back to being independently living units. So he saw it as a series of repeated patterns of social evolution. Now we've got Natalie here, and I very much identify with the concepts behind her suggestion that the term symbiogenesis can be used as a generic metapattern that can be an object of study that happens on many different levels, has happened repeatedly. She proposes in some of her papers, it's not only applied to biological evolution, but you can look at symbiogenesis, the coming together of formerly independent units into larger wholes in cultural evolution. And she also notes that Freeman Dyson was talking about physics in this way, and you were, at least you didn't make a big deal about it, but you were not antagonistic toward it, right? So, and then E.O. Wilson has a concept of consilience, that somehow from the deepest levels of physics up into the more complex levels of human culture it's an unbroken universe. The universe is one song, and somehow all these different disciplines that happen in fields of knowledge and happen in universities are all part of one universe, and we have to try to understand how they connect. So the term I'm going to use, now in the abstract, I was using so I had to I want to coin a term for this that's generic. And first I was using symbiosis, the generation of new from being together, but then I switched to combogenesis. And my notebooks are full of dozens of different coinages. English doesn't have, Natalie has symbiogenesis, but I'm doing combogenesis, the genesis through combination. And I am going to bring out the issue of whether one should use this for any kind of combination, like baking a cake, for example, or I'm really looking at some of the major levels here. So combogenesis, things are coming together here through combogenesis, and you make a new whole with now these parts being in relationship to each other. And a very big key I want to emphasize is that this gives birth to new relations. Because if you have new relations, then these entities on the level I+1 themselves can start relating, and if they form something larger and new relations are born, we can have a way to start getting at a common language, perhaps, to describe the buildup of Bernowski's stratified stability from the elementary particles up to culture. So I want to emphasize here, it's not just bigger. This is not just planetesimals going into planets, which is just gravity at a larger scale. It has to be new kinds of relations that I see as really kind of a key to integrating this buildup. And so I see it as maybe a series of steps. I don't think they're always vertical. They could be ramps. They could be micro steps within here. But these parts are building into these parts, which build up into here. And many of you will recognize this is sort of a diagrammatic paradigm of some of the levels of what biologists have been calling the major transitions of evolution. My interest in terms of using this as a research framework is that one can start identifying different levels of metapatterns. One can talk about what I'm going to say is within level metapatterns. So now there can be perhaps convergences within a level if this is multicellularity. You can also talk about cross-level within realm metapatterns, patterns that are occurring across levels because this combinogenic process might have certain repeating components to what challenges were met as these buildups took place. So the result, so I was thinking, well, at minimum, how many steps were there? And it turns out that we are products of a 12-step program of the cosmos that we kind of emerged from. Now, I'm not going to make a big thing out of the 12. They're just kind of my analysis of it. But it goes from particles in the standard model up to the state. And I put level 13 being a question mark because are we going beyond the state now? I think we've been in the state for thousands of years. But let me just run you through them. I'm not going to go into them because I want to get into some of the cross-level connections and some of the questions that are arising from this. So level 1, the elementary particles, the relations are given by the gauge bosons. The universe just gave us things and relations. They're all elementary particles, but there's the fermions on the left and the bosons on the right, which are the particles of relationship. So right away at the beginning of the universe, we don't have to argue. We don't have to try to figure out, what are the new relationships from the parts. Not trying to get into string theory or anything, but that we have interactions to start. Level 2, the nucleons, the protons and neutrons, combination of quarks and gluons. The new relations here are that the color charge of the quarks is very much weakened, and it extends outward in a way that can now be approximately the same magnitude of strength as the electrical charges of the protons, which the neutrons help mitigate, and allows the formation of level 3 nuclei. The new relations that result here is that because neutrons and protons as a binary system can combine into different kind of combinations with isotopes and with a maximum of about 92 protons and naturally occurring elements, what's the new relation is that we get in the universe concentrated positive charges of 92 different digital types. So we're starting to get some complexity come into play here. And then level 4, the atoms. Because the positive charges attract electrons into various orbitals and shells, and the way the electrons are, that you can now have excess or lack of electrons, and you now have the new kinds of relations that give the possibility of level 5. The molecules, And with the molecules, you get for the first time non-spherical structures. You can get very complicated configurations. And I'll mention a little bit later, now you also have almost a near infinity of possibilities from the periodic table. And so you get very subtle electrical components, which various theories of the origin of life say that now molecules are going to interact with each other. There's probably sub-steps within here, but the basic outcome is the prokaryotic cell. And the key new relation that I see with life is that the input and output of matter and energy is required for the continuation of the arrow of structure, of continuity of these of units on the living realm. And so you get import of nutrients and export of waste, which means the environment is now changed. There's competition among these entities because some of them are depleting the environment of nutrients. And if there's a way to have variation, there's going to be selection, and now you enter evolution. We know that prokaryotic cells, pretty good evidence, combine to form eukaryotic cells. So that was level 7. The new relations here, a little bit problematic. I'm not getting good answers for it, but probably something to do with, ultimately, and we know from hindsight, because they led to multicellularity, the ability to modify each other's genome. And it looks like sex is part of that solution. Well, it's but not part of that solution to doing multicellularity. I don't want to get too teleological here, but sex seems to be a base quality of the eukaryotic cell. An example of multicellular organisms now, level 8, and you can also get prokaryote multicellular. I may mention a bit about that later. Diatoms. There's like 20 different examples out there in nature of multicellularity. So one thing interesting about multicellularity is that it's convergent evolution on a scale of these steps. And some of the major transitions people have been make a big deal of this. The next step really came through the animal multicellularity. Plants and fungi go into ecosystems. That's a different kind of combogenesis than what happened to the animals. The new relations that I see are the use of sight and sound to create relations. And because what this did, it allowed, it broke free from physical contact or even the need to pass chemicals back and forth, although they do pass chemicals back and forth, like ants do. But it allowed structures to form, systems to form of remote relationships between the components, the animals. And so level 9, my level 9 is the animal society. And I think what's important here is that now you have a social in-group and out-group. So you have the inside and outside forming as a social entity that is in the kind of agreement system of the individuals in there. So in some sense, this social world is within the in and out of the group is now within the individual brains. They talk about the apes having fission-fusion dynamics, very flexible ability to form groups and break groups, and some people talk about humans as being kind of super fission-fusion. The next level, if you follow this logic through, you would say that the next level would be now a community of communities. Community of communities. And I think that has something to do with what I'm calling level 10, the human cultural networks, because many of the scholars who study, let's say, hunter-gatherer bands find that it's not the band, even though it can be in competition with other band, almost always there are large-scale sharing agreements that happen, that these bands are in cultural networks that are larger than the sort of the ecology, food-limited size of the band. So whereas the ape communities had genetic exchange between them, the humans now have kind of a cultural exchange, and this is the birth of culture at level 10. And we heard today discussions about the widespread patterning that happens over large geographical areas, such as the Venus figurines. Is my example. Level 11 is agricultural villages. This is Now what I see in the human system is that you have this network of units, and then there's now I want to say a word about complex hunter-gatherer groups, that in places of abundant resources, larger villages with social hierarchies were able to happen. Pacific Northwest United States, the Jomon of Japan, probably the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia started having villages before agriculture. There were a tendency for human groups to start getting larger, just like there was biological advantages to being larger. There were advantages for these cultural groups to be larger. But why I say this is a new level is because it's really bringing plants and animals into the system. And what that did, that allowed these life support systems to be much more mobile, because with the complex hunter and gatherers, when they started forming permanent villages in places like where the salmon were running in great densities and they had a bigger food, they were limited, they were kind of tied to these resource sites. Where now it's like having solar panels on a space station. You know, you can now go into an environment that you could not have lived at those densities. So that's why I will submit that level 11 agriculture, bringing plants and animals in, is the next level. And then the state. Now the state is getting larger again. So there is an enlarging here. But why it's a new level of combogenesis has something to do with, from following the literature on this, people like Charles Spencer and Dubreuil, the invention of there had to be some key inventions, and one was the invention of takeover, or of gifts to get people to join you, other groups to join. In Mesopotamia, this happened where you had smaller kingdoms join into an empire, often through conquest, but there's different ways to then mollify, to mollify these groups and to make larger, that they call, some of the archaeologists call like level 4, tier 4, or 4 levels of a hierarchy, where it starts being way beyond what you could travel in a day, let's say in a kingdom. There's also talk about specialization of sanction, where now how to govern people other than in face-to-face communication takes place. And this really allowed these cities of 100,000 to take place. I think in some ways we are still in this form of organization. You could walk into these cities and probably not feel too much, you could feel at home, if you're not in chains or something like that. It's, now some comments about using these levels as data, or as examples that I'm binning into, let's say, a sequence of combogenesis events. And I want to note that the atoms, a few number of types of atoms in the periodic table generate a huge diversity in the molecules. And this pattern occurs in the start of biological evolution. Often the genetic code is mentioned here, but I want to emphasize the amino acids generating the proteins from 20 types of amino acids, and how similar that is to the human language, or the oral language, or the written, it depends on what language you're using, but let's say phonemes in English, you're talking about like 40 phonemes. Small numbers of sounds can generate a near infinite diversity. And I'm calling this a metapattern, an alphabetic holarchy. It's been called by people discrete infinity or combinatorial explosion. And I want to point out it occurs at least in 3 places: atoms to molecules, amino acids to proteins within level 6, and phonemes to words within level 10. And what I see is that in this alphabetic holarchy, there's an alphabet tier and there's a near infinity tier. So there's a tier of small numbers of components that are repeated in different combinations in near infinity tier. Now, what does this have to do? It seems like it has something to do with, well, if this came in at the start of the evolution of life and at the start of cultural evolution, I believe it has something to do with what I'm calling PVS dynamics. Now, we heard Alex Masudi today and several people talking about Boyd and Richardson, and Natalie has talked about a a logical skeleton for evolution. And I am liking the term propagate, vary, and select as generic ways, because you can think about processes in culture to propagate kinds of automobiles. Engineers vary them, our designers vary them. They're selected in various ways. And so this stuff about this morning, did evolution happen? Can we talk about cultural evolution? I submit that if we're talking about concentrating on PVS as a kind of a recipe or logical skeleton, then we can talk about evolution of culture, or evolution of biology, of life. It's not that there's not other ways of forming patterns in culture, but we can focus in on these. And it seems that the certain levels, that the alphabetic holarchy, to me, it's probably not just a coincidence that these alphabetic holarchies appeared at the base levels of new kinds of dynamics, of biological evolution and cultural evolution. So that at the base of what I'm now calling the realm of biological evolution, the prokaryotic cell had the amino acid to protein alphabetic holarchy, which gives you a natural way to create variation. There's inherent propagation, because otherwise life is not life, and there is selection because of the in and out of matter and energy creates scarcity in the environment, and therefore there's selection processes. The same thing happens in cultural evolution with language starting off giving a natural way to have variation. Now, to explain this a little bit more, I see that the realms of levels have key dynamics within them that are governing, to a large extent, the formation of the levels and the new patterns within that realm. So physical law, it's the modification of the fundamental forces of the standard model. Biological evolution, it's biological PVS given by the kinds of combinatorial possibilities of the genetic coded amino acid alphabet. It's inherent in the in and out of matter and the creation of scarcity and therefore competition between organisms. Cultural evolution, it's given by the possibilities of the symbolic alphabetic holarchy of language. And I think it's key, at least in my mind, that we have to probably consider a dual-tier PVS of this. And what do I mean by the dual-tier? That there's a PVS happening in the human mind. This was talked about today with Bissin and his discussion of choice, human choice. We create scenarios in our minds, and then we vary them, and then we maybe take action, we make choice. But there's also PVS processes among people. This is partly what I think makes cultural evolution so complex, because it's going to need to take into account both these levels. So, and it can be market selection, it can be collective agreements and disagreements, it can be decisions by somebody in the center saying, okay, everybody dance to my tune. And so so the suggestion here is to focus studies of cultural evolution on these processes of what Natalie likes to call the logical skeleton. Also, the units of cultural evolution. Thinking about it, I keep returning to the point that anything that can be named can be evolved. And so it's very much associated, not limited to language, not that it couldn't happen before language, but if you can name it, you can vary it, you can talk about it with others, you can make decisions on it, and that leads to one of the problems of units, because there's huge number. You can vary a part of an automobile, you can vary the whole automobile, you can vary the business plan. Anything you can talk about, you can evolve. Now, why are there steps? Why are there steps in levels necessary to get to culture? I'm not saying they're necessary in a teleological sense, but they were necessary. It's because the interactions of units had certain kinds of limitations on cell size and surface area volume conditions, for example. On villages going to states were limited by the kinds of behavioral controls that existed in smaller scale societies. This is like work by Christopher Bohm, for example. And so the combogenesis were ways of overcoming various limitations, and so the space of the opportunity was there. This is going into a space of possibilities that gets repeated in a helical kind of way as these steps are taken. So what I think that this does, it makes a research agenda to seek out across realm metapatterns that maybe look at the patterns that occurred both in biological and cultural evolution, cross-level but within realm metapatterns. So what is it in biological evolution that now repeats itself? And so a lot of the major transitions people are into this. The way that so they say you have to police the eukaryotic cell, had to find ways to subdue self-assertion issues of the prokaryotic symbionts, and the way that was done was by transferring the genome. Ant societies have only a few of the ants have reproductive potential, just the way the multicellular body, let's say if the human has only a few of the cells that has reproductive potential. There are repeating patterns within each realm across the level. And then there are within level metapatterns, which would be things like classical convergent evolution, or the fact that some of these steps took place multiple times, which is a kind of convergence. So I want to just mention one of the famous examples of this is multicellularity. It happened plants, animals, complex multicellularity, fungi maybe 2 or 3 times, red algae, green algae. There's a simple kind of multicellularity that happened in some prokaryotes that did not go to higher level systems that led eventually to us. In fact, the one that really did was the animal. How am I doing for time, Natalie? Okay. So one of the research quests here could be to look for transitions that were singularities, which Christian Douve, who unfortunately died, wrote a book called Singularities in Biological Evolution. Ones that were singularities, like probably the origin of life, the eukaryotic cell. They say the mitochondria was a monophyletic event. It happened once, and then you had evolution happen until the variation happened until the various eukaryotic lineages went to multicellularity. So multicellularity is multiple, animal societies were multiple, agricultural villages were multiple, and states were multiple. We don't know about human bands and cultural networks, whether we want to include Neanderthals in that, or the Crow or Homo sapiens sapiens had something different that had to do with sharing, or these networks. That's still really up for grabs. But you could start now binning the ones with multiple inventions versus the ones that were singularities. I mentioned here, so what I did here, I took some of the steps of biological evolution, prokaryotic cells, eukaryotic cells to complex multicellular organisms, and I just underneath them put Paleolithic bands, agricultural villages, and states. Now I think there's some, I've already pointed out that these first step of the realms seem to be established with propagation, variation, selection systems, propagation, variation, and selection systems with alphabetic holarchies that came into being, that I think gave birth to the possibility of evolution, first biological evolution, and then cultural evolution emerging from biological evolution as a new kind of evolution. But there's some interesting parallels between the eukaryotic cell and agriculture, in which there's some arguments that like Nick Lane, for example, of the UK, says that the main thing that the mitochondria gave the eukaryotic cell was energy. Higher energy density allowed the cell to be bigger, allowed the cell to be more complex. Ultimately, plants and animals coming into human society did that, because now the life support systems could be mobile. There's also, it's a combogenesis of multiple species, so these steps have something in common. And also there was a transfer of genome, so in agricultural villages, from humans just tending the wild plants to eventually cultivating them, it didn't transfer the genome to humans, but there was a control of the genome by the humans, which is now still underway with genetic engineering. So there's some interesting parallels here, as if there was a realm-forming step, and then a sort of a power step that gave these new systems energy. And then I'm just going to loosely suggest some analogies between complex multicellular organisms with their nervous system and state formation, which you get highly complex societies with, you start getting centralized control. nearly the end, and I want to say that these realms that form, there's always stuff outside. There's clouds that happen on Earth that then influence rain and influence the molecules. And the biosphere forms with biological evolution, maybe something called the noosphere forms with cultural evolution. So there's kind of a downward influence as well as the evolution of villages changes human smaller groups. The evolution of the state that always has villages within it, it changes it as they come into being, just as the way the prokaryotic cell gave the possibility of new molecules coming into existence that could not have been before the prokaryotic cell. So developing a kind of a science, or at least a scholarship of all this, will have to take into account this kind of thing. And finally, I want to suggest that another meta-pattern that could be considered would be processes that are aiding combogenesis and processes that are sort of fighting combogenesis. And I followed them through in the physical realm, but you can do this in the biological realm, and the major transitions people are very much involved in. What are advantages from forming higher level units versus what are disadvantages to the former free living units in both cases? Because hey, there's still a lot of bacteria out there in the world. They didn't all become eukaryotic cells. So I'm going to end with that and maybe take some questions, Natalie, if there's some time.